index is down, railroad loadings are down, and as you can see here, the trade deficit has begun to contract. The trade deficit here was this expansion of the trade deficit was a result of the easy monetary policies of the United States, which drove up consumption, but it wasn't accompanied by strong industrial production growth or capacity expansion, and so it drove imports to go up substantially and the trade deficit to expand. Now here you have household spending and residential construction. This is essentially what the household does with his money aside from paying tax. You can see that this was in a downtrend as a percent of the economy in the 60s and 70s, and it bottomed out here around 64% of the economy. Then in the early 80s we had expansionary fiscal policies under Mr. Reagan, and consumption rebounded strongly. Here you have this very strong rebound to around 72% of GDP. Please note that during this phase of strong consumption growth in the early 80s, the current account deficit and the trade deficit widened. Then we remained steady here. We even had for a while a current account surplus in the early 1990s and a relatively minor deficit here. And then here, 99, 2000, what happens? Ultra-expansionary monetary policies, and consumption and residential investment goes up from 72% to 77% of GDP. In other words, the US is a consuming economy, doesn't produce very much, very consumption-oriented. And during that period of time of this excessive consumption, you have the trade deficit going up and the current account deficit ballooning from 2% of GDP to 7% of GDP, essentially from $150 billion annually to $800 billion annually. And that was the source of the international excess liquidity, the money flowing out of the United States into the world, that then had an impact on other economies in ways that I shall explain in a second. But now, with the trade deficit contracting, the current account deficit is also contracting. So it's no longer expanding. We still have $800 billion flowing into the world from the United States, but it's no longer expanding. And that creates a relative tightening of global liquidity. A relative tightening. And this relative tightening is basically bad for asset prices. It is bad for economic growth. It's bad for commodities. But it should be good for the US dollar, everything else being equal. Now, the dollar will also depend on other factors, but basically, purely based on this shrinking trade and current account deficit, the US dollar should at least maintain its present level for a while, or even appreciate against foreign currencies. And I have to say, in the last 6 to 9 months, the US dollar has appreciated significantly, especially against currencies of emerging economies, against the Indian rupee by 20%, against the Korean won also 20%, and so forth and so on, and also against the euro. We were at 160 against the US dollar, now we're 134, 135. So basically, that should be supportive of the US dollar going forward. But it means, obviously, a recession in the US with less consumption and less imports. But I also mentioned one point, and this is important to understand. Simply put, the US doesn't produce anything. It consumes. The rest of the world produces for the United States and exports to the United States. So in a recession, consumption goes down in the US. It's not that bad because they don't produce anything. But for the emerging economies that produce, that's where the real recession will occur, because their industrial production will go down, and capital spending that was driving their economic growth rates and also commodity prices, because if you build new factories, you need more steel, you need more cement, and so forth. That will also go down. And so the market has reacted logically. Not that the US market has performed well, but the emerging markets have performed even worse. They totally collapsed. And so over the last 6 months, the US market has actually outperformed the rest of the world. Now, I mentioned that one has to take government statistics with a grain of salt, and let me explain you why. Core inflation, as I mentioned, excludes food and energy, and so it's a bad measure of the inflation in a system. Here you have the proportion of US household budget spent on food. These are the poorest 20%, and these are the richest 20% of the population.